Good morning, everyone here in North America, and good afternoon to people joining us from Europe or anywhere you might be located around the world. I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar. I'm Jeff Rathke, president of the American German Institute, and we are really pleased to be able to offer today's webinar, which is about housing in the United States and in Germany. And I will not try to, summarize for you. I'll leave that in the capable hands of my colleague, Dr. Eric Langenbacher, who is the director of our program on society, culture, and politics. And he will introduce our speaker and lead us through the day. So without further ado, Eric, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jeff. And let me also welcome everybody to this webinar on this crisp morning here in Washington, D.C., and probably even crisper in Toronto, I would think. It's really my great pleasure to welcome everyone, and especially our speaker today. The topic is a brand new book. I think it's been out for about 2 months. It's highly anticipated, I might also add. It's called Through the Roof: Housing, Capitalism, and the State in America and Germany. And the author, our speaker today, is Dr. Alexander Reisenbichler, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, as well as the research director of the Joint Initiative in German and European Studies. His work is wide-ranging, exploring the politics of housing, financial, and labor markets in both Germany and the United States. He's a former John F. Kennedy Memorial Fellow at Harvard's Mineta Gunsberg Center, and a former DAAD AGI Research Fellow here at the American German Institute. He got his PhD and MA from George Washington University and his Bachelor of Arts from the University of Leipzig. So without further ado, I will hand the floor over to Dr. Reisenbichler. He will give a presentation on the book, its arguments, its main findings, and then we will open it up to questions and comments. I would ask all of our participants who have a question or comment to please type it into the Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen or in the chat function, and then I can collate questions and then pose them to Dr. Heisenbichler. Without further ado, Alex.
Let me share my screen. Can everybody see my shared screen? I assume yes. Yep. Okay, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Jeff and Eric, for the kind introduction, and also for having me back at the AGI. And thank you also for giving me the opportunity to present on my new book, Through the Roof: Housing, Capitalism, and the State in America and Germany. As Eric just mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the main findings and the main argument of the book today, and especially as it relates to Germany. So if you have questions on the American case, I'd be happy to answer them in the Q&A. So let's jump right into it. And I wanted to start with some numbers here that show that Germany is currently experiencing a housing affordability crisis or problem. On the left side, you can see that house prices have doubled in the past 15 years. And on the right side, you can see rental price developments. And since half the German population is actually renting, this is a very important chart to look at as well. So rental prices have increased by 70% for new renters and by 25% for existing renters. The 25% is due to flexible rent controls, of course, in Germany. And so as a result, Germany is having this housing affordability crisis, and policymakers across the political spectrum have called it the new social question of our time. So the latest high-profile politician to make such a statement was actually Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who said housing is one of the most important social questions of our time in his first Regierungserklärung, his government statement to the Bundestag just a couple of months ago. And he really joined the chorus of German politics. It seems like you can't be a German politician anymore without saying these exact words: housing is the new social question of our time. So these include statements from parties as far-ranging as Die Linke to the FDP. And the FDP is not particularly known for a party that has a huge sort of social ambitions, right? So that tells you something about German politics. And of course, all of these parties are responding to the growing public frustration of rising housing costs in Germany, right? So there were large-scale demonstrations in cities like Berlin, but also elsewhere. Here you can see a picture of the rental madness, the Mietenwahnsinn movement in 2019, where 40,000 people took to the streets. Also in the city of Berlin, Deutsche Wohnen and Co. enteignen, this initiative forced a referendum in the city in which 56% of Berliners actually voted to expropriate from commercial landlords in 2021. So they essentially wanted to nationalize 200,000 homes in question. Now, of course, this referendum is non-binding, and with the CDU-led government in Berlin, this is likely going nowhere. But it really sent a strong signal to politicians to get their act together and to do something about housing. And so this is sort of a nice segue to introduce my book. While I do deal with these contemporary politics issues in the book is also really meant to be a much deeper exploration into the political history of housing programs in both Germany and the United States. So let me say a few words about the premise of the book here. When I started working on this subject, people often ask me, how is studying housing political science? Because in both public and academic debates, it was really treated as this apolitical and technical area. Now, of course, now housing is a hot political issue. And so nobody asks me that question anymore. But it's not just a hot political issue in the sense that it's a top political priority. It's also a deeply political issue in that the state is very much involved in housing markets and in rich democracies, whether that's Germany, the United States, or elsewhere. States and governments regulate land use, they regulate rental markets, they regulate mortgage markets, they subsidize all kinds of housing from social housing to home ownership. And this is precisely the kind of government involvement that I look at in Germany and the United States, but also in the last chapter of the book in Austria and Canada and the UK and the Netherlands and Sweden. So the major question, or the central question that I ask in the book is, what explains different housing policy trajectories in the United States and Germany? So the book is meant to, or the book compares the most important housing programs in Germany and the United States from the early 20th century until today. So in that respect, the book is also meant to be a resource for practitioners, for policy experts, and of course for academics who are interested in the political history of major housing programs in both countries and beyond, as I mentioned. So these programs include major tax programs. Think of the mortgage interest deduction in the United States, and also what eventually became the Eigenheimzulage in Germany. So I go into the long array of political history for such programs. Also think of mortgage subsidies in the United States. That is FHA guarantees, that is Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Ginnie Mae subsidies that have evolved over time. Think of social and public housing programs in both countries, and failed attempts of rent control in the United States and relatively successful attempts of rent control in the German case, right? And so what is my method in the book? So in order to trace the decision-making process and the policy-making process, I went into archives on both sides of the Atlantic in order to really get a look behind the scenes in terms of what policymakers really wanted to accomplish with the policies that they adopted. And for the policy, so, and if the archival material is really, supporting the story, the historical story of the early 20th to late 20th century. And then I also conducted interviews with politicians in the Bundestag, Congress, also the Federal Reserve in the United States, the Bundesbank, and some other policy experts on the more recent political developments in the field of housing. And in the book, I basically tackle the following puzzle. In both countries, the state was a fairly dominant actor in both countries' housing markets in the mid-20th century. So in the post-World War II years in Germany and in the post-Depression years in the United States. But over time, this sort of kind of state dominance has diverged. In the United States, policymakers adopted a number of housing programs to tackle the Great Depression. And ever since, time and again, policymakers have expanded programs over time. So in the United States, we see a policy story of policy expansion. And I should note that this is especially the case, and actually only the case, for the US home ownership market. As all of you know, the rental housing support in the United States is nothing more but a footnote in the American political economy. And in the United States today, it has led to, it culminated to an outcome in which there's astronomical state support for mortgages, for private mortgages, for homeowners, right? So you have FHA guarantees. You have billions of dollars of FHA guarantees. You have trillions of dollars in guarantees by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and Ginnie Mae, which are these quasi-public and quasi-nationalized agencies. And even the Federal Reserve provides targeted support for American mortgages, right? So, and this is a story of policy expansion over time. In Germany, the story is quite different. In the post-World War II years, you've had massive state support as well for home ownership markets and also for rental markets for social housing. But over time, this policy support was gradually reduced. So today, we actually don't see a ton of generous policy support for home ownership markets and rental markets. And this is the kind of puzzle that I'm trying to tackle in the book. And I there are existing explanations out there, maybe perhaps not on the exact research question that I asked, but people have studied housing from a variety of perspectives, including the importance of culture, urban legacy. So my colleague and co-author Sebastian Kohl from the Free University Berlin wrote a fantastic book that very much emphasizes how urban legacies have shaped government policies. And others have emphasized how welfare traditions, Germany being a much more generous welfare state than the American minimal welfare state, and how that may have affected government policies in the field of housing. And I don't discard any of those explanations. I think they have a lot of merit. But what I think was missing in the literature and also in the academic and public debate was a political economy story about housing. And so my take in this book is that economic factors very much influence housing policies and housing policy trajectories in both countries. And the core of the argument is that housing plays fundamentally different roles in German and American capitalism. In the United States, service-oriented and demand-led economy, housing functions as the key engine or one of the key engines of growth. And that is because housing is able to stimulate the core elements of the American growth model, which is credit and consumption. And housing also is a major element of key industries in the United States, such as the very large financial sector, the very large insurance sector, the legal sector, as well as the real estate sector as a whole, and that makes housing to be one of the core sectors that can stimulate growth in the American economy. Just to give you a tangible example of this, there's this sort of metaphor that American homeowners use their homes as ATMs, right, as cash machines, so to speak, because frequently they borrow against their homes in order to finance consumer spending or healthcare or all kinds of things. Now, that is certainly not the case in Germany, where this is an unheard of practice, right? So in Germany, housing functions um, um, has a very, very different function in the economy. So first of all, Germany is an industrial and export-based economy, and housing is not a key engine of growth. You almost never hear politicians say, we need to stimulate housing in order to generate demand in the German context, right? But what housing has done historically, and I'm going to talk about this in the next couple of minutes here, is that housing programs have actually assisted Modell Deutschland, the key pillars of Modell Deutschland, the German model, by actually supporting key industries, the key manufacturing industries in the German model. And we'll talk a little bit about this in the next couple of minutes. Now, so from in the post-World War II years, many commentators have shown how there was an export miracle, right? And that was certainly the case. And Modell Deutschland has come about in its modern form based on collective bargaining, a vocational training system, a conservative banking system, and you name it. And my take in the book is that there's one key element missing, which is housing programs, and how housing programs have also contributed to the German export miracle in the post-World War II years. Of course, after the war, there was a massive housing shortage in Germany of 4.6 million homes that needed to be solved. So what the Adenauer government did at the time was to adopt very, very generous social housing programs and also very generous tax subsidies for builders of both rental and owner-occupied housing. And it was a concerted public-private effort because there was neither enough public capital nor private capital, so both had to come together in order to rebuild the country. And the third key element at the time was also to adopt very strict rent controls because the little housing that was available would have been way too expensive for people to pay if it had been left to the market. But the point here is that all these programs were adopted with sensitivity to the economic need of the German economy at the time, right? And so that is the core argument of that part of the book. And you can see a couple of quotes that I'm also going to put on the next slide, is that housing programs were not just that. They were not just housing programs to solve social issues. They were also housing programs to solve economic issues at the time. One of these issues was that there were labor shortages because there was simply not enough housing in industrial areas, which prevented workers from going to work, and industries and factories couldn't ramp up production because the workers couldn't get to work. As a result, when policymakers adopted social housing programs, they did this with sensitivity to industrial needs, to workers' needs in industrial areas so that workers could get to work. And in that sense, it promoted both labor mobility and also productivity because of housing programs made it possible for workers to live closer to their home and to get some proper rest after a workday, which was simply not possible. So Volkswagen is an example where workers had to travel more than 60 kilometers to work. And back then, of course, public transportation was not as advanced as it is today. And the second point, how housing programs have contributed to or have made the German economic model stronger, so to speak, is by boosting its industrial competitiveness. Both rent controls and low-cost housing contributed to price and wage stability, right? And this is a key element of the German model that thrives on low inflation, right? So in essence, how low-cost housing programs, social housing programs, and rent controls try to keep costs down in order also to limit wage demands of workers, which then increase the competitiveness of German firms. So in fact, housing programs were also industrial and wage policies contributing to the export miracle. And if you don't believe me, you can hear it from Ludwig Erhard himself, who gave a speech in 1951 in front of property owners who were very upset with the German government because there was so much state involvement, so many rent controls, and so much social housing in the market that private owners felt they were kind of squeezed. And Erhard agreed with them in principle. Erhard had liberalized prices in other areas of the economy, but not in housing. So he says, I'm sympathetic, and housing in its current form is a form of capitalism that does not deserve the name. But then pretty much in the next part of the speech, he says, but you property owners have to make sacrifices because the competitiveness of our German economy can only be guaranteed if we're able to keep our German price levels somewhat stable, while boosting exports is the fateful task of our people. So exports and industrial competitiveness, that's the overarching macroeconomic objective, and everything else is secondary. And that means that housing for private, property owners had to make sacrifices in the way I described. And if you compare that statement to one of America's most influential economists at the time, Mariner Eccles, who was a New Dealer, who was part of the FDR administration, later became the Fed chair, the Federal Reserve chair. He said something along the lines of housing programs have to become, or New Deal housing programs were the wheel within the wheel to get the to get the American economy going and to grow the American economy. So you can, I didn't put this on the slide here, but the point is that there's this massive contrast in terms of what housing programs were designed to do in the United States to stimulate growth, to stimulate construction, to stimulate credit, to stimulate purchasing power. And in Germany, housing programs were very much designed to keep the price level stable and to help industries by creating housing in industrial areas to mitigate labor shortages. Here's another quote from the Deutsche Industrie- und Handelstag from an archive that basically pinned down the problem, which was that employees have to travel long distances to work, which not only means higher costs, but also lost time for them. It is very much justified for macroeconomic reasons to especially support building new housing for employees. And so the influential German industries really very much demanded sort of housing in areas where labor hotspots, where labor shortages were acute. And so that is what the German government did at the time, right? And you can also see that the influential German labor unions had a say in this as well. And they always threatened with wage increases should rental prices go above a certain level. So they said, so this is from Der Spiegel in 1955, labor unions threatened making rent increases the subject of new wage demands. And this always came up when there was a discussion of liberalizing rent controls or sort of weakening social housing, right? So the major actors of the German model of capitalism were on board with rent control, with social housing programs, because that would strengthen the German economy. And here is just to give you a sense of the magnitude of all of this from 1950 until 1970. In fact, half of all new homes were social housing. So that is 5.8 million homes out of 11.4 million total homes, which tells you that around half of all new housing was social housing, right? And this had a massive price dampening effect on the economy because, housing for most people had become affordable by 1970 when the major shortages had been overcome. And I will bring up this chart again and again as we move through the German housing history, so to speak. And here's just another chart on the distribution of social housing. You can see that in North Rhine-Westphalia, that was the state, the land with the most social housing construction. It's not surprised that it's, of course, also the most industrialized state, and also, of course, the most populous state in Germany. So if people are interested, I can send them the data on this chart. So effectively, the point I was trying to make in this early part of my talk is that that housing is an underexplored pillar of Modell Deutschland, an underexplored element of the German model of capitalism in this early period, reinforcing the export miracle. But then something changed starting in the 1970s. I just mentioned that policymakers across the board considered housing as reinforcing the German economy. But yet they were reaching a tipping point at which they were considering housing to undermine the German economic model. So there are structural factors that help explain why policymakers shifted from thinking that housing would reinforce the German model to undermine the German model from the 1970s until the 1990s. And the first one of this reason is simply that Germany, like any other advanced industrialized country, entered the post-Keynesian period and the post-miracle era. Right, so I mentioned that in 1970, housing supply shortages were mainly overcome, or at least by the early 1970s, they were mainly overcome. And all of a sudden, we've had a host of other economic problems on the horizon, inflation, deficits, unemployment. So housing all of a sudden became a secondary sort of macroeconomic objective. Policymakers thought, well, the problem is more or less solved, and then housing programs sort of came under pressure, especially once the social democratic governments were out of power. Chancellor Kohl started to really reduce social housing programs and also subsidies for limited profit housing organizations, so the Wohngemeinnützigkeit. But for the time being, as a good conservative, so to speak, Chancellor Kohl kept home ownership programs in place. But the point is that these housing programs had sort of reached this tipping point where they were no longer considered to be macroeconomic solutions, but they were were becoming macroeconomic problems themselves. And I'll get into this in a second in more detail. The second structural factor that led to this policy reversal was reunification. And I should say that actually in the short term, unification led to a housing policy renaissance again in the short term, for a short-lived revival of social housing, a short-lived revival of supporting all kinds of housing, from rental housing, social housing to home ownership. But in the long term, as I will show, reunification contributed to the demise and to the retrenchment of housing programs for the reasons that I will get into now. So when scholars and public commentators talk about unification, they mainly talk about the economic shock of unification, which of course was huge. What is less talked about is that unification was also a massive housing shock on the now all German economy. So housing shortages actually returned to the country. And that was because in the East, you had a relatively dilapidated housing stock of older buildings. All these beautiful, now beautiful Gründerzeit homes, let's say in cities of Leipzig, they were in relatively terrible shape, which meant that in the East, you had a housing shortage of around 500,000 homes in 1990. And so, the Kohl government tried to remedy this, as I will talk about in a moment. So the East German government, the GDR, did not take great care of sort of maintaining these older buildings. Instead, they built sort of these prefabricated Plattenbau homes, and one of which I grew up in the city of Leipzig. And but they didn't construct enough of these Plattenbau homes. So again, there was a shortage of 500,000 homes in 1990, mainly because of the dilapidated state of the older housing stock. And in the West, shortages also returned due to migration from the East, not just from the GDR or former GDR in East Germany, but also from Spätaussiedler more generally, right? And just a fun fact for you, at the time, the homeownership rate in East Germany was around 25% and 43% in West Germany. So you can already see some inequalities in terms of wealth at that point in time, which has been relatively sticky until today. So it's no longer a gap of around 20%. It's now a gap of 10 to 15% in terms of Eastern and Western homeownership. So in order to stimulate the East German economy, Helmut Kohl actually adopted sort of what I call an American-style medicine for the East German economy. Housing was his growth strategy for the East. And that, and to a degree, that made sense because East German industries could simply not compete with one of the most competitive industrial sector in West Germany in the world. So what you had to do instead was sort of stimulate domestic demand in order to get the economy growing and stimulate employment and so on. And so what Helmut Kohl said was remarkable. In the city of Leipzig, this is Augustusplatz, he said that the housing industry is East Germany's economic motor in 1993. And that's remarkable because usually German chancellors don't say that housing is a motor of economic growth. Usually they say the the manufacturing sector is the driver of economic growth, or exports are the driver of economic growth, as we have heard with Ludwig Erhard's speech. And so this is quite a remarkable speech to hear that for East Germany. And so what I mean by American-style medicine here is that Kohl adopted, sorry, I just have to move my panel here. Oh, yes. That Kohl adopted massive housing stimulus program in East and West. And by American-style medicine, I mean that he also adopted temporary mortgage interest deductions, so massive credit subsidies for homeowners and other sort of investors into the into the especially Eastern German housing market, but also the Western German housing market. So in order to get rid of these housing shortages, boosting homeownership and rental programs. And indeed, the strategy actually worked. But the problem is it worked too well. As you can see here, again, this is the same chart from earlier. You can see that there was a housing boom in the post-unification years, and there was even a small social housing boom with 150,000 social housing units produced at its peak per year. This is quite still an impressive number compared to today. Um, but you can also see that it dropped off to then the lowest level of housing production in Germany, right? So the boom led to a bust. And that is because there was a lot of overproduction happening, overproduction of housing in East and also partly in West Germany. So in the East, all of a sudden, we went from 500,000 homes missing to 1 million vacant homes. And it's sort of ironic then that the federal government then started to fund housing demolitions in the East. In fact, the Plattenbau building in which I grew up in is now demolished and no longer exists. So the coal government both spend money on building new housing and then also on demolishing housing. And it's interesting because house prices then, so this had implications for the entire German economy. House prices dropped in all of Germany. And it was the only country in the OECD in which house prices actually fell. In most other countries, house prices went up. So that means that the German housing market was remarkably affordable. And if you believe some scholars, it also likely supported cost competitiveness of German industries then during the recovery because housing was kind of cheap. At least that is according also to the work of John Muehlbauer at Oxford, an economist there who has done some work on this. But the larger point here is that Germany now faced large-scale vacancies for the first time in a century, and this set the stage for the eventual complete policy withdrawal or retrenchment that happened in the 2000s. So in the 2000s, of course, Germany was the sick man of the euro. We've seen high unemployment, relatively slow growth, high deficits. And again, what's often forgotten about that period is that housing made Germany's sick man even sicker. You can see two pictures here on the right that show Philipp Holzmann AG, which was a major construction firm in Germany and one of the largest employers. Also, as you can see here, constructing the new Reichstag. So major projects that this firm was tasked to complete and went bankrupt. And so this is a symptom of and because it was one of the largest employers in Germany, it also led to more layoffs and to a complete a slump in the construction industry, and to also reduce capacity in the construction sector in the long term. And so, how did the Merkel government in the 2000s then respond to this? And the Schröder government also started this, by the way, and I'll get to this also in a second. But the response to Germany's structural economic problems, both in the housing sector but also in other sectors of the economy, was to retrench to housing programs. So in many ways, this is complementary to Subventionsabbau efforts, to austerity efforts, and also to the Hartz reform of structural economic reforms. This is just in another area. This is housing. So the Merkel government, the Grand Coalition, eliminated federal social housing programs. Social housing programs now are exclusively done by the Länder. They also eliminated the Eigenheimzulage, which was the largest homeownership program in 2006. And remarkably, they did all of this against the resistance of the entire housing lobby, which vehemently defended homeownership programs in particular. But retrenchment went through in any event. And I wanted to bring up the American contrast here. So when America experienced its own major structural economic crisis, financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, which also originated in the housing sector, what did American policymakers do? They did not retrench government programs, FHA, the tax subsidies, the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Ginnie Mae guarantees, and all of that. Quite the contrary. They doubled down on them, and they expanded government support. They quasi-nationalized Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Ginnie Mae, and all of these institutions, even now, 17 years after the financial crisis, are still quasi-nationalized, even despite all the efforts of President Trump to free them from government control. So this is just a comparative reference here, and how very differently Germany and the US responded to their own systems threatening crises. And again, in Germany, housing programs were seen as part of the problem, not the solution, whereas in the US, it was both the problem and the cure. And so the problem then was, though, that policymakers went overboard. There was policy overshoot with these austerity measures. In the 2000s, German policymakers thought that housing programs contradicted the needs of the German economy. They thought that there were vacancies in Eastern Germany, so no more housing programs were needed. You also see very grim demographic projections. The Federal Statistics Office predicted that Germany would have less than 70 million inhabitants by 2050, right? So that the demographic curve would go down. And as good evidence-based policymakers, they thought, well, we don't need new housing anymore, so we might as well get rid of housing programs, so to speak, to oversimplify. They also thought that housing programs would contribute to fiscal deficits, to price inflation, to capital misallocation in the economy, and that funds would simply be better off in research and innovation and education, the things that really make the German economy more competitive and thrive. The problem is, as we know today, that this response was relatively short-sighted because getting rid of social housing programs and privatizing social housing meant that they also deprived themselves of tools that could tame rents and provide affordable housing in the long term. So they deprived themselves of the tools, effective tools of the past that could help counteract housing affordability crises in the future. And they also eliminated policies that once supported the Modell Deutschland. Here's another interesting statistic. I think that just in the course of about 20 years, the social housing stock has halved from 2 million to 1 million today. And of course, in 1990, I think the number was closer to 3 to 4 million, or in the 1980s, 3 to 4 million. And now we're down to 1 million social housing units. So, and this is not just Angela Merkel's fault. This was really a broad-based political consensus in German politics. So this, when I interviewed a CDU Bundestag member, he said that I don't share the American view of stimulating the economy as a cure for an itch, meaning that housing programs were not part of the solution to cure the sick man of Europe. To the contrary, they were distorting the economy. Similarly, Social Democrats were on board. They called many of these tax subsidies economic nonsense or pointless, and they got the economic rationale and evidence from the Council of Economic Experts, the Sachverständigenrat für Wirtschaft, as well as the German Bundesbank, who opposed many of these housing programs. So in short, these housing reforms, housing policy retrenchment was considered to be part of structural economic reforms to revive the Modell Deutschland. Okay, so transitioning back to today and how all of this undermines now to Germany's economic model today. So today, Germany's housing affordability crisis that I mentioned in the beginning of my talk is what I call in the book a crisis of commission. It's partly produced by past policy mistakes. Whereas in the United States, it's a crisis of omission. And that is the omission being that rental support is so desperately missing in the United States context. And of course, I'm not discounting other factors at work. There are demand side factors. There was a strong economy in Germany for the past 15 years. Of course, not the last 2 or 3 years. There are demographic trends. There were low interest rates by the ECB and so on. There's also supply side constraints. I mentioned that the construction capacity is very low. Land use regulation has become stricter, which makes building more complicated. But even so, past political action is to blame for today's housing affordability crisis because they eliminated the very housing programs that had supported German capitalism in the past. And today, I would go as far as to say that it is an attack on the German model of capitalism. And again, if you don't believe me, you can have a look at other major economic actors in the German economy, such as the Industrie- und Handelskammern, who say that that the housing crisis is threatening their competitiveness. You can again see the union saying that that housing costs are important and that they should be a part of wage negotiations now, and and it's also exacerbating skill shortages in the German economy because it's harder to attract workers to areas of with high living costs and also apprentices to these areas. So I'm almost about to wrap up here, and I just wanted to say that again, coming back to the initial point that all policymakers, all major parties have called housing the social question of our time, and yet I think they have not treated it like one. It has been mainly rhetoric because what you can see in terms of policy action was an unambitious patchwork of housing programs, including very small subsidies for social housing, for home ownership, for private rental investors, for limited profit housing associations. All of these are very small. And one thing that was perhaps a bit more ambitious was the Mietpreisbremse, the rental brake, to limit increasing rents for new rental contract. The Merz government just renewed this. And Merz's Bauturbo in particular is about cutting red tape. So it just passed as well. It's meant to provide local communities with the ability to speed up construction and conversion approvals, liberalize land use. But again, even the housing industry itself is very, very skeptical that it will lead to a massive speeding up of housing construction and will really ramp up housing numbers by much. So so one of the problems here is that it's not just not enough houses being built in Germany, it's not enough social housing being built in Germany. You can see on the left side here that you have about 30 to 37,000 new social housing units a year, and this is down from 450,000 annual social housing units, new social housing units a year in the 1950s, and that was in West Germany alone. So this is has been a historical low point for about 20 years. Okay, so to wrap up, so what are the main lessons here from the German case? The first one is that housing crises, no matter how bad, can be solved, but it's a matter of political will. Germany has solved housing crises much more severe than today's, and it can do so again. The second lesson is that affordable and indeed climate-friendly housing requires a much stronger role of the state than we currently see. You need to go big. We need to go beyond the rhetoric of the social, that housing, calling housing the social question of our time. If it is the social question of our time, we need to also treat it like one, and which requires a much stronger role of the state. Third, historically, framing housing as a national economic issue and not as a social issue has helped garner support for major housing programs. As soon as you call housing policy social policy, you're relegated to welfare policy. And in a country which is still obsessed with balancing budgets, social programs are major social programs, pretty much dead on arrival. So what you need to emphasize is how housing programs can support the Mittelstand, can support the German economy, and basically help cure Germany, which is currently the sick man of Europe, again. And finally, this is sort of the point I just made. Affordable housing programs can indeed strengthen the key pillars of the Modell Deutschland. They can attract skilled workers, strengthen apprenticeship systems, support the Mittelstand, and also limit wage cost spirals, all of which is very important for the German model. Yeah, well, if there's any questions, please let me know. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. That was incredibly rich. And I have a ton of questions myself. I see that we already have one question in the Q&A panel. If any of the other participants want to type something in, that would be great as well. So, I mean, I want to ask, I guess the FDPler in me is going to come out, right? So, I mean, your policy recommendation is to go big, and that there has to be a big state role. So that's going to cost money.
Yes.
But I haven't looked at the exact figures in the last week or so, but it seems to me that, government spending has not really been reduced as a percentage of GDP. And every time I talk to Germans, they always complain about how high their taxes are and what have you. So where would the money for this push come from?
That's a really good question. It's the $1 million question, right? So I think my point here is that if you make it not just a social issue, but an economic issue, you can justify a bigger portion for housing in the German budget. So I think that is, yes, you need more spending, direct spending on this. But one thing that comes out of the American case is actually that the German government could be a little bit more creative in terms of financial instruments, right? So the American story is really one of government guarantees also in financial markets. So basically, the state is behind mortgage debt, which reduces the cost of mortgage debt, which would then allow, let's say, builders to build more cheaply because it reduces their financing costs. And that is how they can create more affordable housing. And if you do this for rental housing and for social housing companies, some of the Gemeinnützige, for example, I think this could also go a long way and it wouldn't cost the German government all that much.
And then, I'm going to also violate another one of my rules, which is not to always talk about the AFD, but I do want to kind of pose the question because I could imagine many people on the populist right, and not just on the populist right, maybe on the populist left as well, say that, well, another way to address this, crisis of affordability is just to reduce demand. And of course, one way to reduce demand is to reduce the population, or at least to reduce population growth by restricting migration. So how would you respond to people who talk about the demand side?
Um, Well, I think you're putting the finger onto something very important, which is that the AfD is definitely exploiting that. And it's not just the AfD, by the way. I mean, if our chancellor uses words like the Stadtbild has changed, I mean, it is implicitly saying exactly what you just said, that there's more people from different backgrounds in cities that create all kinds of pressures, including onto housing. And I think that's a very problematic and dangerous thing to frame it that way. But it is indeed what is happening with the AfD. And my response to this is, again, housing problems much bigger than today's have been solved in the past with smart policy. And the German government can do this again. If you want to, and it's dangerous to link housing to migration and to these kinds of things. If you want to solve the housing problem, adopt smart housing policy. I think this is the right approach, and it's not about restricting migration or something like that. Because at the end of the day, restricting migration is not contributing to more housing in Germany on the supply side, right? It's not creating a new supply of housing anywhere. So I would think that any policymakers, especially the ones in the CDU, would be very well advised to stay away from making these connections between migration and housing because it is fueling the populist right, as you say. I agree. But if you want to tackle housing problems, focus on housing policy.
All right. Okay, so let's go to a question from Mark Vale, actually. So he writes here, you characterize German housing retrenchment in the 2000s as a misdiagnosis of Germany's economic challenges. You also suggest that there were broad-based opposition to housing programs across the ideological spectrum. So to what extent was the problem an empirical misdiagnosis, or alternatively, ideologically based opposition to state involvement on the demand side of the economy?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I think it's a bit of both. And in their defense, I've shown you the demographic projections. They were pretty grim at the time, and so was the economic mood in Germany, if you remember, in the 2000s. So, you know, I have a little bit of sympathy to policymakers at that time. Where my sympathy ends is that it's not just about reducing programs. It's about outright eliminating them and not thinking of any eventualities in the future that, well, guess what? Housing is cyclical, like any other economic sector, right? And this is where perhaps the ideology comes in, where they thought, austerity and structural economic reforms are important to get the sick man out of its economic slump, but I think they just kind of overdid it. But it's a bit of a mix, I think, to Mark's very very good question of both, um, um, and yeah, and a misdiagnosis of the empirical reality, or at least in terms of what the future could hold, and also and I believe that austerity and structural economic reforms are the better medicine to get Germany out of the crisis. And in the long term, these prove to be just kind of wrong. Even if you speak with people from the CDU, they all regret eliminating social housing programs in 2006, and they wish they could go back in time.
All right, I can't help but make a comment, which hopefully also has a question in it, kind of as well, for Alex to respond to. So, you mentioned East Germany before. I remember reading an article about a whole town basically being abandoned and being put on the market for
Yeah.
someone to buy. When I go to my dad's hometown in Oberfranken in Bavaria, I mean, half of the little village is, not being occupied right now. So it seems to me that, there's two kind of diametrically opposed trends going on, that there isn't enough housing in places where people want to be
Yeah.
in Germany, and there's too many in places that just aren't economically viable, are aging, and everything like that. So, I mean, I guess the question is, how can the government respond to the kind of misallocation problem?
Yes, and the misallocation problem you raise is spot on, right? So we see this in many East German towns. They're sort of dying out. There are some vacancies. So there are regional disparities. Cities like Leipzig, Dresden, they're kind of booming still, also and are getting more expensive, and other parts of the more East German hinterland, so to speak, is cheap and vacant. So that's a major problem. The other problem that I wanted to add to yours is actually household size and how many people live in these apartments, right? So there is definitely also problems there, that a lot of old people have no incentive to move when let's say they lose their spouse eventually in old age, right? But they're in this massive apartment that is very large. But now, if they wanted to downsize, they would pay more for that downsized apartment than where they currently live, right? So they're kind of trapped. So the market is frozen in that sense, and that's another really really big issue that needs to be fixed. Now, in terms of solutions, I think that we need more housing in the hotspots. So I agree. So there needs to be more supply. This can be conversions. This can be new construction. It's harder to, of course, you know, um, micromanage people's movements. I think that the government can't do this. Um, in terms of the hinterland that you mentioned, and I don't mean this to sound condescending. I think one thing the government can do is maybe not so much in the housing area, but to make these small villages better connected to the hotspots, right? So that also younger people have an incentive to live there and commute by train, of course, not by car, in the bigger cities, to provide better infrastructure in terms of healthcare there, public transportation, and just make these places a bit more attractive and pay attention to them. But it's a pretty vague answer. I acknowledge that, but that is where I would go.
All right, I can't resist going big. I mean, you said that the German government should go big, kind of thing. So, I mean, when we look at the international environment today, I know that all the IR folks are trying to come up with a new name for what the new world is. With the demise of the liberal international order. But it seems also, in terms of a variety of capitalism, or a kind of paradigm of capitalism, that we're also in a period of flux, and something new is emerging as well. I mean, we're clearly well past the height of the neoliberal consensus and everything like that. There seems to be a new form of almost state capitalism that is emerging. If I think about the United States and, you know, the Trump administration taking stakes in various companies and things like that. So how does this relate to what you're talking about in the German context? Is there kind of like a new version of state capitalism that you think is going to be coming out of it? And this is, of course, in addition to the spending 5%, okay, 3.5%, and then 1.5% on, you know, defense-related spending priorities, infrastructure, everything like that. So are we going to see a return of this older model?
I think we are, and I think you're right that, we're in this whatever we want to call it, the new geo-economic order or something, and perhaps a new era of state capitalism. It's a good question, and I think it's an opportunity for the German housing market as well to be a part of this, right? And this is what some of the German housing policy experts criticize, that housing is not part of these critical infrastructure spendings. Only 3% of whatever the number is allocated for housing. And I think I mean, if you buy into my argument, at least, there's a very good case that housing should be part of Germany's industrial strategy in order to help get workers to where the work is, labor demand is very acute, where living is very expensive, so that and there's just this major story in the Financial Times this morning. I don't know if you've read it, about Germany's industrial demise and the demise of the Mittelstand not doing well. And I think housing is just exactly one aspect of to help them back on their feet. So it should be part of the industrial strategy, much like it was in the 1950s. And by the way, I don't want to turn back time and go back to the 1950s and sort of replicate what they did back then. But I think there are lessons to be learned from that period, and especially to view housing as more than just that, as a social issue, but it can be part of this industrial strategy in the new geo-economic in the new geo-economic order. I agree.
And I guess one of the arguments one could make to the FTP types out there is that if this would contribute to higher levels of economic growth, that means there's more tax revenue coming in. And
Yes,
so it should be seen as a win-win situation. Exactly.
precisely.
All right, we're almost at the end of our time, but there's one more question that I'll go to from the Q&A. And it is, since we know that housing issues are cyclical, what are the ways to anticipate the need to dial state interventions up and down and design policies and systems that fluctuate with the cycles and that eliminate the need to regain political will each time a housing and economic intervention is needed?
Exactly. I mean, I think the answer is actually in the question, and I think it's flexible tools. You need a toolkit that you can ramp up when it's needed, and that you can sort of, yes, reduce when it's not needed. But I think the person who asked the question, I think, is also spot on to say that we shouldn't always lose sight of the historical lessons and the lessons of the past just because we consider a problem solved for a decade, let's say. And then the next decade, we're like, oh my God, where do we start? No, we know where to start, right? So, and this is a good way to frame it. There should be flexible ways to ramp up and scale down housing programs. But yes, and it shouldn't become this cycle of political debate each time when a housing affordability crisis happen. Now, again, to be fair, all of these things are not easy to ramp up. Construction capacity is very difficult to ramp up in the short term. It takes a long time to build a house. It takes a long time to approve a house, and all of these things. But I still agree with the premise of the question, and I think that we should do better on that front by being more flexible.
You know, I can't resist one final observation, which is I remember I did an interview once when I was doing my own kind of field research, and it was a priest I was talking to, and the priest was very pessimistic about the long-term German future because he said the fundamental characteristic of Germans is that they're perfectionists. They always have to be the best at whatever they do and do things thoroughly, right? So they were the best monarchists, then they were the most thorough fascists. Now they have to be the best Democrats, and I can't help but see some resonance here as well, right? So it seems like when the German government goes for a policy or decides to get rid of a policy, they go all the way and they're completely
Yes.
thorough. And maybe they just need to learn to muddle through a little bit more, like many other peoples.
I think that's a really nice way of framing it. But I think the takeaway here is to have a toolkit ready. It's like when, and to use it when you need it, and to be updated about the merits of that toolkit and not throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. So I think that would be interesting. And by the way, the churches, of course, since you mentioned the pastor now, they were major contributors to social housing production in Germany too, right? It wasn't just the municipalities, it was the labor unions, it was the churches, it was employers too. It was again this cross societal effort to build social housing, and I think it would be nice to see that happening again.
All right, well, with that optimistic note, we have come to full time. So, Alex, let me thank you for taking the time to share the argument and the findings of your excellent new book. Thanks to our participants for attending today. And I guess I would just end by encouraging everybody to try to get a copy of this book because I really think it's absolutely terrific. So thank you and have a good day.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.